In 1962 and 1963, George Martin's quest to break the Beatles into the American market became an uphill battle that almost derailed the band's global dominance before it began. Martin, a classically trained producer who had signed the Beatles to EMI's Parlophone label in the UK, understood the value of the US market. Despite the Beatles' growing success in Britain, their early efforts to break through in the United States were stymied by EMI's US affiliate, Capitol Records, which refused to release their music. This led Martin to broker deals with smaller US labels. But his struggle to get America to listen to the Beatles was a story of perseverance in the face of repeated setbacks. In late 1962, the Beatles had just released their first single, Love Me Do, in the UK. While the single reached a modest number 17 on the British charts, George Martin believed that the group had the potential to succeed internationally. He immediately set his sights on America, which represented not only a vast market, but also cultural dominance in the music industry. Martin's first task was to convince Capitol Records, EMI's American subsidiary, to release the Beatles' music in the US Capitol. However, was not enthusiastic about British acts, as their previous efforts to promote them had been largely unsuccessful. The man at the center of this resistance was Dave Dexter Jr., Capitol's head of A&R, who had long held the belief that American audiences would not respond to British groups, particularly one like the Beatles with their unique blend of rock, pop, and skiffle. In December 1962, Martin had a pivotal meeting with Dexter in which he presented Love Me Do and Please Please Me, hoping that Capitol would agree to distribute the singles. Dexter, however, was unmoved, famously dismissing the Beatles' sound as unsuitable for the American market. He told Martin, "It's just not something that will work here. American kids are into their own rock and roll," citing the dominance of American acts like Elvis Presley and the early Motown sound. Dexter's refusal was final, and it was a major setback for Martin. For months, Martin had to continue pushing the Beatles' growing catalog, only to be met with repeated rejection. Faced with Capitol's indifference, Martin began exploring alternative routes. Since EMI still had global reach, Martin turned to smaller, independent labels to distribute the Beatles' singles in the US. His first success came with VJ Records, a Chicago-based label known for releasing R&B and doo-wop hits by African-American artists. In January 1963, Martin struck a deal with Ewart Abner, the president of VJ, for the label to release Please Please Me in the US. It was a last-ditch effort, but Martin believed that even a smaller label like VJ could serve as a springboard for the Beatles in the States. On February 25, 1963, VJ released Please Please Me in the US, but it was virtually ignored. The label was struggling financially and had little to no resources to promote the single. Abner had promised Martin that the single would get attention, but without a serious marketing push, the song failed to chart. For Martin, this was yet another disappointment. He had high hopes, but without sufficient promotional muscle, the release made little impact. As Martin later recalled, "We knew we had something special, but without the proper channels, it was like shouting into a void." Despite the failure with VJ, Martin persisted. In September 1963, he arranged a deal with Swan Records, a Philadelphia-based label, to release She Loves You. Swan had previously had success with rock and roll hits, and Martin hoped this would be the break they needed. However, like VJ, Swan had limited resources and marketing reach. Although She Loves You was a massive hit in the UK, it again failed to chart in the US. Martin's frustration grew. "It felt like we were spinning our wheels," he remarked. "These smaller labels couldn't give us the platform we needed, but Capitol still wouldn't budge." By late 1963, the Beatles had reached unprecedented heights in the UK. Their second album, With the Beatles, was a massive success, and their popularity in Europe was exploding. Meanwhile, Martin continued his relentless campaign to convince Capitol that they were missing out on something huge. In November 1963, Martin, along with EMI managing director Sir Joseph Lockwood, launched a more aggressive approach. They pressured Capitol's executives directly, with Lockwood reportedly stating in a meeting, "If you pass on this again, you're making the biggest mistake in the history of the company." At last, Capitol agreed to release I Want to Hold Your Hand in the US on January 13, 1964. However, fate intervened when American DJs began playing imported copies of the single ahead of its official release date, creating a buzz that Capitol could no longer ignore. In response, Capitol rushed the release of I Want to Hold Your Hand to December 26, 1963, and allocated $50,000, a massive sum at the time, to promote the record, something they had never done for any of the Beatles' earlier singles. Capitol's reluctance to release the Beatles' music in 1962 and 1963 had significant consequences. For over a year, the Beatles were largely unknown in the United States, even as they became the biggest act in the UK. This delay had a silver lining, however. It created a pent-up demand among American listeners who had heard about the Beatles' success across the Atlantic. By the time I Want to Hold Your Hand was released, American fans were hungry for something new and exciting. The single became an instant hit, reaching #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 by January 1964, just in time for the Beatles' first visit to the US. This pent-up demand meant that when the Beatles finally broke through in the US, they did so in an unprecedented fashion. Within months, Beatlemania swept the country. Their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964 was watched by over 73 million people, cementing their place in American popular culture. By April 1964, the Beatles occupied the top 5 spots on the Billboard charts, an achievement that no other artist had ever accomplished. The very delays and struggles that Martin endured in getting Capitol to release the Beatles' music had inadvertently contributed to the massive wave of success that followed. While the deals with Vijay and Swan failed to produce immediate results, they taught George Martin important lessons about the American music industry. He realized that the fragmented nature of the US market, with its regional labels and distribution networks, made it nearly impossible for an unknown British band to succeed without the backing of a major label. Martin's conversations with executives at both Vijay and Swan were cordial but ultimately fruitless. They simply didn't have the resources to launch the Beatles on the scale required for the US market. These early struggles, however, helped shape Martin's approach to future international releases. When Capitol finally came on board, Martin and EMI ensured that the Beatles would receive the kind of promotional push that matched their talent and growing global stature. By the end of 1964, the Beatles had become not just a British sensation but an international phenomenon, and George Martin's tireless efforts to break into the American market were finally vindicated. In reflecting on those early years, Martin acknowledged the frustration but also recognized the eventual reward. It was worth the fight. Capitol didn't see it at first, but when they did, everything changed. The Beatles were unstoppable, and America couldn't get enough of them.